Alright, in this lesson we're going to talk about protists and fungus. You're in the middle of a unit where you're looking at the diversity of organisms on the planet and you're looking at all of the kingdoms. In general, know that you just have to know kind of on the surface stuff about each of these groups of organisms, and we're not going in very great depth. We'll go into a bit more depth when we get to plants and animals. Alright, so moving into protists, we are now in the first kingdom of eukaryotes that we've discussed. Okay, so all the bacteria that we discussed were all prokaryotic. Now we're starting to look at eukaryotic protists and fungus. And there are three types of protists, and we group them into these groups, which are false groups. They're not taxonomic groups, so they don't actually go with the classification. But we group them based on how they get their nutrition. So you have plant-like, which we call the algae, and they get their nutrition by doing photosynthesis. Okay, you have the animal-like, and the animal-like are called protozoans. Okay, and they get their nutrition by eating others. And then the fungus-like protists are also called the slime molds or the cellular slime molds, and they get their nutrition by decomposing things. So they're named based on their nutrition. In terms of how they move, you've got three methods of movement. You've got pseudopods, flagella, and cilia. So let's look at each of these individually. Alright, the first kind of movement is cilia, and we've talked about this before. These are these little hairs that surround the organism, okay, and these beat to allow the organism to move. Now here's what a live paramecium looks like underneath a microscope. This is Paramecium, and Paramecium, notice you've got a contractile vacuole there. You've got this structure called an oral groove, which ends in something called a gullet, which is kind of like the Paramecium stomach. You've got more contractile vacuoles here. You've got two nuclei, a macronucleus and a micronucleus. These guys can do conjugation and exchange nuclei with one another. You also have little vacuoles that will empty to the outside world, and they produce an anal pore. Okay, so that's what a typical Paramecium looks like. And Paramecium using cilia. The next type of movement is the flagellum, and this is the flagellum, and usually you have one or a couple flagella on organisms that move using a flagellum. This is Euglena, and Euglena is spelled with an E, so it's E-U-G-L-E-N-A. This is an algae, so here's what Euglena looks like under a microscope. It has contractile vacuole, nucleus, and so on, just like other things. But it's an algae, and it actually has what's called a photoreceptor inside of its cell. It's a little organelle that senses light because it's an algae, so it can actually swim into the light to continue to do photosynthesis. By the way, that Paramecium on the previous slide is a protozoan, so it's not an algae, it's an animal-like protist. Alright, so this guy is going to move using this flagellum. The next type of movement is the pseudopod, and here's a pseudopod here. The pseudopod is a projection from the cytoplasm where the organism starts to extend the cell out in one direction, and then the cytoplasm kind of streams toward the pseudopod. There are several pseudopods on this amoeba that you see here, okay, and the cytoplasm is moving toward those pseudopods to kind of pull the amoeba along. Here is a picture of what this amoeba looks like underneath a microscope. Here's a pseudopod. Here's a pseudopod. Pseudopods can also surround a food particle, which is what you're seeing here. That's food, and these pseudopods are surrounding. So this is the slowest method of movement for a protist, but it is the most directed movement. Cilia and flagella are very, very quick types of movement. Amoeba don't go anywhere particularly fast. So those are movement, and that gives you kind of an idea of what some of these look like. Amoeba, by the way, is a protozoan as well. All right, so the protists themselves, they're all eukaryotic, so they're going to have all this stuff inside of them, all the membrane-bound organelles, plus some specialized organelles because they're single-celled, so they don't have organs. Some of these protists are not harmless, they're actually harmful. Some of them cause disease. And the ones which cause disease we call the sporozoans. Okay, and examples of this would be the diseases like amoebic dysentery. Malaria is a big one. Malaria is caused by an amoeba called Plasmodium, and it's transferred from person to person by a mosquito, a special mosquito called the Anopheles mosquito. There's one that's common in the United States, a disease called Giardia, and it's a protozoan that gets into our water supply and can make us very sick as well. All of these affect different parts of the body, and some of them can infect other organisms. Some of them have a vector that transfers them, like malaria. The mosquito is the vector. But what happens is these get inside of our bodies and take nutrients from us and can make us sick. Some of these guys produce toxins, and we try to flush them out and often get very, very bad diarrhea or vomiting, which can cause dehydration and death. So they can be pretty serious. This is obviously a parasitic relationship. So these are known as the parasitic diseases, or these are some of the parasitic diseases. In terms of protists, that's what you've got to know, that and what's in your book. So let's move on to the next thing, which are the fungi. And the first thing you need to understand about the fungus is they're all multicellular, and except for the yeast, which are unicellular, and also except for the yeast, the fungi are decomposers. That's kind of their job in ecosystems. So if you look all the way down on your note sheet, what's the main function of fungi in the environment? Their main function is to decompose stuff. Typically when you think of a fungus, you think of something like a mushroom. But what you're looking at when you see the mushroom is really the spore delivery system. It's called the sporangium. It's the reproductive part of the fungus. The main body of the fungus is this mycelium, which is a network of thread-like hyphae underground. Hyphae are the individual threads. Mycelium is the collective group of threads. The hyphae give structure and support, but they also feed the organism because they penetrate a food source, and then they secrete digestive enzymes into the food. Then when the food is liquefied, they absorb it, and that's known as extracellular digestion. So that's kind of what fungus look like. So here's the thing. These fungi only produce sporangium when they're sexually mature. So for example, like a bread mold, if you see mold on a bread, what you're seeing is the sporangium of the mold. By the time you see that, that fungus has been on that bread for a while and has been growing through that bread for a while, which means it's already mature and producing sporangia. So just cutting the moldy part off the end is not going to actually take the fungus out of the bread. The fungus is already all the way through the bread. In terms of reproduction, most fungi can produce sexually. What that happens is when their hyphae touch underground, one fungus comes from one side, one comes from the other, and when their hyphae touch, they can do conjugation. By the way, the protists can do conjugation as well, can reproduce sexually. So both of these groups will reproduce sexually through conjugation, where they're exchanging genetic material, or in the case of the protists, they're exchanging nuclei. There is also asexual reproduction in both groups, protists and fungus. If you cut a fungus, it can actually regenerate. That's called fragmentation. You also have budding. Budding is an asexual process. It's a natural cloning process that fungi can do. Essentially what happens with budding, a yeast is just a circular cell. The yeast will start to get what looks like a little tumor growing on the side. That tumor gets larger and larger, and then eventually just kind of pops off and becomes a smaller yeast. That's budding. And like I said, it's kind of different from mitosis because you're not producing equally sized organisms. Notice you still have the original adult organism and then this tiny little one. All right, so just to wrap it up, here is a mushroom. And notice, like I said, this is the sporangium here. So the thing that you see is the sporangium. Notice, here's the mycelium all under the surface of the ground. So the mycelium are these network of threads, and the threads are called hyphae. The hyphae extend up into the sporangium, and then there are spore-producing structures in the gills of the mushroom, and the spores are released from the gills of the mushroom, and you can kind of see that blown up here. What the spore producing or what the mycelium look like, all kind of blown up. What's interesting to note is if you were to see one of these fungi, then what you would notice is under the ground is that these look like plant roots. These mycelium, or the mycelium looks like plant roots. It's virtually impossible to tell the difference just from sight between plant roots and hyphae of a fungus. And that's really important because these can form what's called a mycorrhizal relationship. Myco refers to the fungus, rhizae refers to a plant. Plants and fungi have this mutualistic relationship where the plant hyphae, or the plant, roots can get wrapped in these fungus hyphae. The reason why this is important is the plant can actually feed sugars to this fungus. The fungus actually helps the plant absorb water and minerals from the soil so they can pass each other things that they need. And what they find is that plants actually grow better when they are in the presence of these mycorrhizal relationships. So plants grow better if they're grown in soil that contains fungus than they grow in sterilized soil. By the way, before we leave this topic, there are some fungi that do cause disease. They're not really, some of them are real dangerous diseases. Like a lot of times spores can get into your lungs. There's an infection that's been hitting the West Coast lately called Cryptococcus that's making people very sick because the spores get into people's lungs. Most of the time, though, fungal diseases are just more of a nuisance. Things like athlete's foot, yeasts that grow in orifices of the body like thrush in babies, stuff like that. Mostly they just cause you to itch and are just make you uncomfortable. Usually they're not life-threatening. There are a few examples of life-threatening ones, but not very many. But that's what you need to know about protists and fungus.